Chapter 1. Introduction. The Call to Jerusalem. Hardly any other event in the Middle Ages has had such a profound impact on Europe and the Middle East as the Crusades. For almost 2 centuries, from the late 11th to the 13th century, armies of knights, peasants, monks, and adventurers poured into the East to conquer or defend the Holy Land. They left behind castles, stories of blood and faith, and a memory that still has an impact today between fascination, horror, and myth. The idea that it was possible and just to wage war in the name of God was not a matter of course for the people of the Middle Ages. But in 1095, Pope Urban II in Clermont called on Christianity to liberate the tomb of Christ in Jerusalem. With this sermon, he lit a fire that changed the world. The appeal combined piety and a thirst for adventure, religious longing, and political power struggles. For contemporaries, Jerusalem was more than just a city. It was the place where Jesus was crucified and resurrected, a sacred center of the world. The fact that this city was under Muslim rule was a scandal for many Christians, who demanded an answer. Urban II offered this answer: the Holy War. Those who joined the crusade, he promised, would receive forgiveness for their sins and enter paradise like a pilgrim, even if they fell in battle. But the Crusades were more than an expression of faith. They were also a political and social phenomenon. For younger sons of the nobility, who could not expect an inheritance, they offered a chance for fame and property. For kings and princes, they were a means of sending restless knights to distant lands and securing their own power at home. And for the papacy, they were an instrument to extend its authority over the whole of Europe. The Crusades changed not only the world of Christians, but also that of Muslims. For them, the Crusaders were invaders, strangers who occupied their lands and desecrated their cities. The resistance against the Crusaders produced figures like Saladin, who are still revered as heroes of Islam today. So 2 worlds faced each other. And yet at the same time, they were connected through trade, diplomacy, and cultural contact. The picture of the Crusades is therefore complex. They were characterized by deep piety, but also by cruelty. They led to massacres of Jews and Muslims, but also to cultural exchange that enriched Europe in the long term. They brought the rise of the knightly orders, the emergence of new trade routes, and the penetration of Oriental ideas and products to the West. This story, which began in 1095 and ended in 1291 with the fall of Acre, is more than a succession of wars. It is a chapter about faith and power, hope and bloodshed, encounter and misunderstanding. The Crusades show us how religion can become the driving force of politics and how ideas move people to set entire continents in motion. Before we devote ourselves to the individual Crusades, it is worth taking a look at the world in which they originated: Europe, Byzantium, and the Islamic East of the 11th century. Because only those who understand this world will understand why the call to Jerusalem could have such a powerful effect. Chapter 2. The World of the 11th Century: Christians, Muslims, and Byzantium. The Crusades did not fall from the sky. They were the result of a world situation in which religious longing, political interests, and military threats were intertwined. To understand why Pope Urban II was so listened to in 1095, we need to look at the 3 great powers of the 11th century: Latin Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world. Europe on the move. In the West, Europe was characterized by fragmentation. Small principalities, rival kings, and a constant struggle for land and power determined the picture. Chivalry had developed, heavily armored warriors who possessed great power through their weapons and horses. But many of these knights were restless, pugnacious, and difficult to steer into peaceful channels. The Church therefore looked for ways to harness this energy, and finally found it in the idea of the Crusade. At the same time, Europe experienced a phase of population growth and economic upswing. More people, more food, more exercise. Farmers cleared forests, new cities were built, trade flourished. This growth created not only opportunities, but also tensions. Many nobles were looking for new perspectives, and the promise of finding land and wealth in the East fell on open ears. Byzantium in distress. To the east was the Byzantine Empire, heir to the ancient Roman Empire, with its capital Constantinople, one of the richest cities in the world. But Byzantium was in a difficult situation. Since the 11th century, the Seljuks, a Turkish equestrian people, have besieged the Byzantine territories in Asia Minor. In 1071, Byzantium suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Manzikert, which caused large parts of Anatolia to fall into Muslim hands. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was desperately looking for help. He turned to the West, not in the expectation of getting huge armies, but to win mercenaries and support against the Seljuks. He could hardly have guessed that this would result in a huge crusade. The Islamic world. The Islamic world was also not united in the 11th century. Although the Abbasid caliphs still ruled Baghdad as spiritual leaders, their power was largely symbolic. The real control lay with regional rulers, the Seljuks in the east, the Fatimids in Egypt, and a large number of local emirs. This fragmentation made it possible for the Crusaders to gain a foothold in the first place. Nevertheless, the Islamic culture of the time was superior to the European culture in many respects. Cities such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo were centers of science, art, and trade. Medicine, astronomy, and philosophy flourished, while Europe was still strongly influenced by feudalism. But political conflicts weakened the Islamic world and opened up space for the Crusaders' attacks. An area of tension. Between these three worlds, the emerging but fragmented West, the beleaguered Byzantium, and the divided Islamic world, the field of tension arose that prepared the ground for the Crusades. For the Christians of Europe, Jerusalem was not only a distant city, but the center of their spiritual world. For Byzantium, it was a symbol of the lost empire that had to be regained. For the Muslims, it was a holy city that they had revered for centuries. It was almost inevitable that all these demands had to collide. So the stage was set when Pope Urban II expressed his call to Jerusalem. The world was full of energy, conflict, and longing, exactly the mixture that produced the Crusades. Chapter 3. Pope Urban II and the Idea of Holy War. In 1095, at the Synod of Clermont in France, an event took place that would change the history of Europe and the Middle East for centuries. Pope Urban II raised his voice there and called on Christianity to take an armed march to the Holy Land. With his sermon, he created something completely new, the idea of a holy war that was blessed by the Church and promised eternal salvation to the fighters. Urban II was not an insignificant pope. He stood in the tradition of the church reforms of the 11th century, which sought to strengthen the papacy and free the church from secular influence. For him, the crusade was a double tool. It could extend the power of the church over the knights and kings of Europe and, at the same time, bring help to the beleaguered Byzantine Empire. The sermon in Clermont was dramatic. Urban described the situation in the East in gloomy colors. Christians are oppressed by Muslims, holy sites are desecrated, pilgrims are mistreated. He appealed to the faith, but also to the honor of the knights. And he offered a unique promise: whoever took the cross would be forgiven of all his sins. For a society that was deeply influenced by the thought of salvation, this was a message of immeasurable power. The Pope's call struck a nerve. Knights, peasants, monks, simple men and women, everyone felt addressed. Some of religious fervor, others of the hope of adventure, booty, or land. Soon the battle cry, Deus le vult, God wants it, over the whole of Europe. Urban II knew how to portray the crusade not as an ordinary war, but as a pilgrimage with the sword. Everyone who accepted the cross was not only a fighter, but at the same time a pilgrim, a penitent, who accomplished his journey to God with a sword in his hand. In doing so, he elevated war to a spiritual dimension that set it apart from all previous conflicts. At the same time, Urban also had very secular goals. The crusade was intended to direct the energy of the knights, who often kept Europe itself in turmoil with their feuds and raids, outwards. Instead of fighting each other in endless wars, they should now turn against the infidel enemy. The crusade was thus also a means of pacifying Europe by exporting violence. Last but not least, the crusade served the papacy itself. He offered Urban the chance to demonstrate his spiritual authority. While kings and princes often quarreled, the Pope was now able to act as the supreme leader of a great, united project, a political signal of enormous significance. The effect was not long in coming. In towns and villages, clergymen preached the crusade, nobles solemnly swore to take the cross, and ordinary people sewed red cloth crosses on their clothes as a sign of their vows. A stream of people began to gather, a movement that no one could stop. Thus the idea was born in Clermont that was to determine the next 2 centuries, that one could go to war for God, that the sword could become an instrument of faith, that a knight could win not only glory but also eternal life in battle. Urban II had not only proclaimed a military expedition, he had ushered in a new era. Chapter 4. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, from Europe to Jerusalem. The call of Pope Urban II found an echo in Europe that exceeded all expectations. Within a few months, armies of knights, peasants, priests, and adventurers gathered, a stream of people that moved eastwards. The First Crusade was born, and it was to become one of the most astonishing but also bloodiest undertakings of the Middle Ages. The People's Crusade. Even before the great armies of knights were formed, a wave of enthusiasm broke out among the common people. Farmers, craftsmen, women, and children set off, led by preachers such as Peter the Hermit. Without sufficient equipment, without planning, and without military leadership, this People's Army moved eastwards. On their way, pogroms against Jewish communities along the Rhine occurred, a dark chapter that showed how religious fanaticism also claimed innocent victims. The People's Crusade ended tragically. In Asia Minor, the unorganized pilgrims met the Seljuks and were almost completely destroyed. But the actual armies of knights soon followed. The armies of knights are forming. 4 great armies set out from different parts of Europe in 1096: France, the Holy Roman Empire, southern Italy, and Provence. Leaders such as Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Toronto, Raymond of Toulouse, and Hugh of Vermandois were at its head. They all swore to carry the cross, but each also had their own ambitions for land, power, and fame. The journey was arduous. Thousands of people had to be cared for over long distances, and hunger, disease, and looting accompanied the trains. When the Crusaders reached the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was suspicious. He had expected mercenaries, not mass armies. Nevertheless, he promised support if the Crusaders returned the conquered territories to him. First victories in Asia Minor. The first major battles took place in Asia Minor. At Dorylaeum in 1097, the Crusaders won a decisive victory over the Seljuks. From there, they conquered the important cities of Nicaea and Antioch. But the siege of Antioch was a nightmare. For months, the Crusaders starved, diseases killed many, and betrayal seemed to be in the air. It was only through a mixture of luck, betrayal, and fanatical faith that the city was captured. A special moment was the discovery of the alleged Holy Lance, with which a Roman soldier is said to have pierced Christ. Whether it was genuine or not did not matter. It strengthened the faith of the Crusaders and gave them new strength. The road to Jerusalem. After years of fighting, the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in 1099. At that time, the city was in the hands of the Fatimids from Egypt. The siege began on 7th June, and the breakthrough was achieved on 15th July. What followed was one of the most gruesome massacres of the Middle Ages. Contemporary chroniclers report that the streets of the city were flooded with blood. Muslims, Jews, even Christians of other denominations were slaughtered. For the Crusaders, it was the completion of their mission. They had liberated the tomb of Christ, and in their religious ecstasy, they saw themselves as instruments of God. The birth of the Crusader states. After the conquest of Jerusalem, the Crusaders founded several states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. These entities were fragments in the midst of a hostile environment, but for a moment it seemed as if the impossible had succeeded: a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land. For the people of Europe, the First Crusade was a miracle. Despite hunger, defeat, and danger, the Crusaders had conquered Jerusalem, something that no one would have thought possible. For the Muslims, on the other hand, it was a catastrophe, a shock that was to drive them to fight back in the coming decades. The First Crusade was thus more than a military success. It was a spiritual event that showed how strong the power of faith, propaganda, and political calculation could be. But it was also a portent. The cruelty with which Jerusalem was conquered left wounds that shaped the relationship between Christians and Muslims for centuries. Chapter 5. The Conquest of Jerusalem and the Birth of the Crusader States. When the walls of Jerusalem fell on July 15, 1099, it was the highlight of the Crusaders' journey, the reward for years of deprivation, and at the same time, the beginning of a new era. The city, which was considered the heart of Christianity, was back in Christian hands after almost 500 years of Muslim rule. For the pilgrims and knights who had risked everything, this was no ordinary victory, but the fulfillment of a divine plan. But the conquest was accompanied by unspeakable cruelty. Contemporary chroniclers described how Muslims and Jews were massacred in the city. Entire streets were drenched in blood, and no house was spared. Whether the reports were exaggerated or not, what is certain is that the capture of Jerusalem left a trauma for the Muslim world and cemented the reputation of the Crusaders as cruel invaders, even in distant lands. Nevertheless, the Crusaders saw their work as sacred. Many believed that Christ himself had led them and that their bloodshed had been justified by the victory at the tomb of the Lord. The news sparked enthusiasm in Europe. Preachers proclaimed the miracle of Jerusalem, and the Pope saw his vision confirmed. The order of the New World. After the victory, the question immediately arose: how should the conquered land be administered? Many of the Crusaders had vowed to return after the conquest, but others wanted to stay and start a new life in the East. This is how the idea of the Crusader states was born: small Christian-ruled principalities in the midst of a Muslim-majority world. At the top was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was initially ruled by Godfrey of Bouillon. He rejected the title of king and modestly called himself Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. After his death, however, his brother Baldwin took over the reign and assumed the title of King of Jerusalem. In addition to the kingdom, 3 other states were created: the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. Together, they formed a network of Christian rulers, but they were militarily weak and geographically fragmented. Everyday life in the Holy Land. Life in these Crusader states was a constant balancing act. The Christian rulers were a small minority in a predominantly Muslim and Jewish country. They relied on castles and fortresses that they built and on supplies from Europe. At the same time, new forms of coexistence developed. Trade, diplomacy, and even alliances between Christians and Muslims were not uncommon. The Crusader states became melting pots. European knights met Oriental cultures, learned new techniques, spices, clothing styles, and even medical knowledge. Many settled permanently and adapted to the new environment. The fragile balance. But the survival of the Crusader states was uncertain from the beginning. Surrounded by Muslim powers, they were constantly threatened. Without constant supplies from Europe, they would hardly have lasted. At the same time, there was a lack of unity among the Crusaders themselves. Rivalries between the princes, disputes over castles and territories weakened their position. Despite all the difficulties, they managed to survive for almost a century. They built mighty castles, organized trade routes, and became an integral part of the world of the Middle Ages. But the ground beneath her feet was always unsafe, and soon it would become clear how fragile her empire really was. The birth of the Crusader states was thus both a triumph and a burden, a victory over the impossible, but also the beginning of a constant struggle for survival. The Crusaders had achieved their goal, but they had placed themselves in a world they could never fully control. Chapter 6. Between Two Worlds. Everyday Life and Society in the Holy Land. After the conquest of Jerusalem and the founding of the Crusader states, a new chapter began for the Crusaders. They had not only conquered the land, they now also had to inhabit and administer it. A crusade had turned into a settlement movement, and suddenly, knights, nobles, and pilgrims were faced with the challenge of building a lasting life in a foreign world. Foreign masters in a foreign country. The Crusaders represented only a tiny minority, perhaps 10% of the population. The overwhelming majority consisted of Muslims, Jews, and Oriental Christians who had lived there for centuries. For the new gentlemen, this was a challenge on the one hand, but an opportunity on the other. They had to involve the locals to keep the country economically alive, and they used their knowledge to organize agriculture, trade, and administration. Many Crusaders who had originally come as pilgrims decided to stay. They built castles, planted fields, and founded families. Arabic clothing, Oriental food, and even parts of the architecture found their way into the everyday life of the Franks, as the Crusaders were called by the locals. Society and rule. The Crusader states were organized according to the European model, with kings, princes, counts, and vassals. But reality forced adjustments. The knights were dependent on the support of the local population, especially the farmers who cultivated the fields. Many cities remained multicultural. Christians of different denominations, Muslims, and Jews lived side by side, although not without tensions. The Crusaders brought their own legal system with them, but also created new hybrid forms in which Oriental traditions flowed. In cities such as Acre, Antioch, or Jerusalem, a lively trade developed in which European and Oriental merchants did business. Castles and security. Since the Crusader states were constantly threatened by enemies, the landscape was covered with castles. These were not only military bases, but also administrative centers. Farmers, traders, and craftsmen settled around the castles who lived under the protection of the knights. Some of these castles, such as the Crac de Chevalier, became symbols of Crusader rule. Cultural contact and knowledge transfer. Life in the Holy Land led to an intensive cultural exchange. Europeans learned about Arabic medicine, philosophy, and mathematics, adopted new foods such as citrus fruits and sugarcane, and discovered luxury goods such as silk, glassware, and spices. Conversely, they brought their own traditions and shaped the architecture, combining Romanesque and Gothic styles with Oriental elements. It was not uncommon for Crusaders to marry women from the region or to form alliances with local rulers. These interdependencies ensured that the Crusader states were less isolated than was imagined in Europe. They were bridges between East and West, between Christianity and Islam. A fragile equilibrium. But despite all the adjustments, the rule of the Crusaders remained fragile. Their military strength was limited, they were dependent on constant supplies from Europe, and the rivalries between the princes further weakened them. Above all, however, the hostility of the Muslim world remained. For many Muslims, the Crusaders were foreign rulers, invaders who occupied their land. Life in the Holy Land was therefore a life between two worlds, between faith and everyday life, between conquest and integration, between war and coexistence. For some, it was a new home, for others, a constant threat. This area of tension shaped the Crusader states from the beginning and prepared the ground for the coming conflicts. Chapter 7. The role of the knightly orders, Templars, Knights of St. John, and Teutonic orders. The Crusader states would hardly have been viable without the support of special institutions. Among all the forces at work in the Holy Land, the orders of chivalry played a key role. They were an invention of the time, a unique combination of monasticism and chivalry, and they embodied the ideal of war in the name of God like no one else. The Knights of St. John, from hospital to knightly order. The Johanniter made the start. Originally, their mission was purely charitable. They ran a hospital in Jerusalem where pilgrims and the sick were cared for. But they soon realized that the supply alone was not enough. The pilgrims also needed protection, and so the Knights of St. John gradually developed into a military order in the 12th century. Their special feature was the double task. They remained a community of mercy, ran hospitals, but they also carried the sword. This made them an indispensable pillar of the Crusader states, which saw in the Knights of St. John loyal defenders and helpers at the same time. The Templars, warriors of Christ. The Knights Templar became even more famous. They were founded around 1119 with the express aim of protecting pilgrims on the dangerous routes between Jaffa and Jerusalem. Its name was derived from its quarters on the former Temple Square in Jerusalem. The order quickly received papal recognition and became one of the most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages. The Templars combined ascetic monastic life with absolute military discipline. Their castles, such as the fortress of Safed or Atlet, were bulwarks against the attacks of the Muslims. At the same time, they developed an extensive network in Europe that collected donations, managed property, and organized supplies to the Holy Land. The Templars were not only warriors, but also symbolic figures. They embodied the idea of the Milites Christi, the Knight of Christ who was willing to sacrifice his life in the fight for the faith. Her white coat with the red cross became a sign that impressed friend and foe alike. The Teutonic Order, late arrival with its own path. A little later, the Teutonic Order took the stage. It was initially founded as a hospital community during the Third Crusade, but soon developed into an order of knights as well. Its special feature was its close ties to German nobles and princes. In the Holy Land, he initially played only a supporting role, but later he shifted his main task to the Baltic Sea region, where he built up a formidable territorial power in Prussia and the Baltic states. Strategic importance. All three orders had a central function. They gave stability to the Crusader states. While secular princes were often entangled in rivalries, the orders remained more reliable due to their strict organization and international networking. They built castles, organized defense lines, and provided elite troops who were feared on the battlefield. Their independence from the local nobility made them particularly valuable, and sometimes problematic, because the orders were only subordinate to the Pope, not to the kings or princes in the Holy Land. This gave them freedom, but also led to tensions with the secular rulers. Between ideal and reality. As much as the knightly orders embodied the ideal of the Crusaders, they were also part of the contradictions of the era. They lived by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and yet they amassed immense wealth and power. They were considered defenders of the faith, and yet they were involved in political intrigues. Nevertheless, there is no doubt. Without the Templars, the Knights of St. John, and the Teutonic Order, the history of the Crusades would have been different. They were the spearhead and backbone of the Crusader states, and they shaped the image of the Crusader to this day. Chapter 8. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, The Dream and the Failure. The euphoria of the First Crusade had astonished Europe. The fact that simple knights and pilgrims had conquered Jerusalem was considered a miracle, but this miracle was fragile. The Crusader states lay like narrow islands in a hostile sea. Just a few decades after their founding, it became clear how vulnerable they were, and the call for a new crusade was heard. The fall of Edessa. The trigger was the loss of the county of Edessa in 1144. Edessa was the northernmost and, at the same time, the weakest Crusader state. When the Muslim troops under Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul, conquered the city, it was a shock for Christianity. For the first time, a significant territory was lost, and this raised doubts about the viability of the entire project. The news reached Europe and caused panic and outrage. Preachers such as Bernard of Clairvaux called for a new crusade. This time, it was not just to be a procession of individual knights. Kings themselves were to raise the flag of the cross. The kings moved to the Holy Land. The Second Crusade was the first to be led by rulers themselves. The French king Louis VII and the German emperor Conrad III took the cross. Their participation gave the company enormous prestige. Whole armies gathered, stronger and better organized than the first time. But from the beginning, the train was under a bad star. The German troops marching through Asia Minor ran into supply difficulties and were defeated by the Seljuks near Dorylaeum. Conrad III had to retreat to Constantinople with the remnants of his army. The French troops also suffered heavy losses on their march through Anatolia. Hunger, heat, and constant attacks weakened the army. When the survivors finally reached the Holy Land, they were exhausted and demoralized. The Damascus Fiasco. In 1148, the Crusaders met in Jerusalem. There, they decided to attack the city of Damascus, a goal that was militarily and politically questionable. Damascus had even been an ally against other Muslim powers at times, but the Crusaders hoped to set a strong symbol with his conquest. The siege of Damascus proved to be a disaster. After only a few days, the Crusaders had to call off the attack, plagued by a lack of water, unexpectedly strong resistance, and internal strife. Instead of a victory, the crusade ended in disgrace. Consequences of failure. The Second Crusade was a fiasco. It did not bring any profit, but considerably weakened the reputation of the Crusaders. For the Muslims, it was proof that the Crusaders were not invincible. For the Christians of Europe, it was a bitter disappointment. The fact that the company had been led by kings weighed particularly heavily. While the success of the First Crusade had been interpreted as a divine miracle, the failure of the Second Crusade appeared as divine punishment. Critics saw this as a sign that God was chastening Christianity for its sins. Nevertheless, the crusade had an important consequence. It led to a new unification among Muslims. Zengi's successors, especially his son Nur ad-Din, acted as defenders of Islam and united Syria against the Crusaders. This set the stage for the rise of an even more powerful opponent, Saladin. The Second Crusade thus marked a turning point. The time of easy victories was over. From now on, the Crusaders faced an increasingly united and self-confident opponent. The dream of a secure Christian empire in the East began to fade, and in its place came the hard struggle for survival. Chapter 9. Saladin and Jihad, the rise of Muslim resistance. The failure of the Second Crusade marked the beginning of a new phase. While the Crusaders were campaigning for support in Europe and defending their weak rulers in the Holy Land, resistance was forming on the Muslim side, which was not only militarily but also religiously supported. In this movement, a figure emerged who is still a symbol of the Muslim resistance against the Crusaders, Saladin. The idea of jihad. Already under Zengi and his son Nur ad-Din, the idea had developed that the fight against the Crusaders should be understood not only as a political confrontation, but also as a religious duty, as jihad, the holy struggle to defend Islam. This ideal gave Muslim rulers a common ground that went beyond regional rivalries. While the Crusaders were often at odds with each other, the Get idea of jihad created unity. He turned the dispute into more than a war over land. It was about faith, about honor, about the relationship between Christianity and Islam itself. The rise of Saladin. In this context, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known as Saladin, took the stage. Originally a Kurdish officer in the service of Nur ad-Din, he rose rapidly through the ranks in the 1160s. In 1171, he deposed the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and united the country under his rule. He had thus gained the most powerful base in the Middle East, rich granaries, access to the Mediterranean, and a central location. Saladin was a master at combining politics and religion. He presented himself as a pious ruler who embodied jihad, and at the same time as a clever strategist who expanded his power through diplomacy, marriages, and skillful alliances. Step by step, he united Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt under his control. The decisive battle. The climax of his rise came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. The Crusaders, led by the Kingdom of Jerusalem, marched in scorching heat, poorly supplied with water, and arrogant in their attitude. Saladin lured them into a trap, cut off their supply routes, and surrounded them. The defeat of the Crusaders was devastating. The Crusader army was almost completely wiped out, and many knights were captured, including the King of Jerusalem. The fate of the Knights Templar and Knights of St. John was particularly notorious. Many of them were executed because Saladin regarded them as fanatical enemies. Shortly thereafter, Jerusalem fell into his hands. But unlike the Crusaders in 1099, Saladin did not have a massacre committed. The Christian population was allowed to leave the city for ransom. Many churches remained unscathed. This behavior made him the epitome of a chivalrous enemy, not only in the Islamic world, but also among some Christians. Symbol and legacy. With the conquest of Jerusalem, Saladin became a hero of Islam. He had not only won militarily, but also fulfilled the religious mission that had driven Muslims for decades. For Christendom, on the other hand, the loss of Jerusalem was a shock that was almost incomprehensible. Europe immediately called for a new crusade, the Third. But Saladin remained more than a military victor. He became a legend that continues to have an impact today. A ruler who combined faith and politics, who fought against his enemies with harshness, but also acted with dignity and magnanimity. While many crusaders were remembered as cruel conquerors, Saladin embodied the image of the honorable opponent, an image that aroused admiration even in the chronicles of Christians. Saladin's rise brought not only a military turnaround, but also a shift in symbols and ideas. The jihad against the Crusaders had now become a reality, and the Christians had to realize that their rule in the Holy Land was not permanently secured. Chapter 10. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 hit Europe like a thunderclap. The news spread quickly and triggered horror, outrage, and religious shock. Jerusalem was not just a city, it was the center of the Christian faith, the tomb of Christ, the destination of countless pilgrims. The fact that it had fallen into the hands of the Muslims seemed like a divine punishment and, at the same time, like a call to take it back. Thus began the Third Crusade, the most famous of all because it pitted the greatest rulers of his time against each other: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa against the mighty Saladin. The German emperor on the way. First, it was the old emperor Frederick Barbarossa who set off. He set out in 1189 with a huge army, crossed the Balkans, and penetrated deep into Anatolia. Many saw him as the true savior, whose experience and authority could lead Christendom to victory. But his crusade ended abruptly in a tragic way. Barbarossa drowned while crossing a river in Cilicia in June 1190. His death caused his army to break apart, and only a few of his knights reached the Holy Land. Rivalry of kings. Thus, the main burden lay with the kings of France and England. Philip II Augustus and Richard I the Lionheart set out in 1190, both ambitious, both rivals. They met in the Mediterranean, took part in the siege of Acre together, and forced the city to fall in 1191 after 2 years. This victory was an important moral success, but it also deepened tensions between the two kings. Philip, who felt overshadowed by Richard, soon returned to France to pursue his own interests. Richard was left alone, and thus became the real hero of the crusade. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. The battle between Richard and Saladin was more than a war, it was a duel between two legends. Famous for his courage and military brilliance, Richard led the Crusaders to several victories, including the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191, in which he decisively defeated Saladin's troops. His tactical skills, his fearless courage, and his personal bravery made him the epitome of the Crusader. But despite his successes, Richard did not succeed in reconquering Jerusalem. He advanced close to the city several times, but logistics, the climate, and the constant threat from Saladin's troops caused the plan to fail. Richard had to realize that the reconquest of Jerusalem was more than a military goal. It was a task that his exhausted and decimated troops could not accomplish. Ceasefire and mutual respect. In the end, the only way left was diplomacy. In 1192, Richard and Saladin concluded a truce that allowed Christians free access to Jerusalem as pilgrims, while the city remained under Muslim control. For many Crusaders, this was a disappointment. Jerusalem was lost. But it was also a pragmatic outcome that prevented further bloodshed. A remarkable mutual respect developed between Richard and Saladin during this time. Both were considered ideal knights of their culture. Richard as an intrepid fighter, Saladin as a magnanimous ruler. Chroniclers report gestures of respect, such as how Saladin sent Richard horses when he lost his mount in battle. Whether all these stories are literally true is uncertain, but they show how much the encounter between the two men became the stuff of legends even at that time. The legacy of the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade did not bring Jerusalem back, but it saved the Crusader states from utter destruction. Acre remained in Christian hands, and a corridor along the coast secured the basis for further life in the Holy Land. At the same time, the Crusade changed the image of the Crusades themselves. It became a stage of great personalities, a confrontation of kings and heroes. For Europe, despite its limited success, the Third Crusade remained a moment of pride. Richard the Lionheart returned as a legend, Saladin as an admired opponent. But at its core, the problem remained unsolved. Jerusalem was lost, and it was never to fall permanently into Christian hands again.
Chapter 11. Between Diplomacy and War, the Fragile Balance in the Holy Land. After the Third Crusade, the fate of the Holy Land was not decided, but only postponed. Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule, but the Crusaders continued to hold important coastal cities such as Acre, Jaffa, or Tyre. A narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean Sea formed the remaining kingdom of Jerusalem, which was a series of scattered enclaves rather than a contiguous state. In this fragile order, an era began in which diplomacy became as important as the sword. An empire without a capital. The fact that Jerusalem was lost meant not only a military but also a symbolic blow for the Crusaders. The Holy City had been the heart of their enterprise, and without it, the Kingdom of Jerusalem seemed like a body without a heart. Acre now took on the role of the new capital, a bustling port, trading center, and political center at the same time. But Acre was not Jerusalem, and the awareness that the real goal had not been achieved weighed heavily on the morale of Christians. Constant threat. The Christian possessions were threatened from all sides. Saladin had died in 1193, but his empire soon fell into several parts, ruled by his sons and relatives. These divisions offered opportunities for the Crusaders, but they did not make the situation any less dangerous. Again and again, there were border skirmishes, sieges, and raids. There was hardly a fortress that did not live in a constant state of alert. Diplomacy as a weapon. In this uncertain situation, the Crusaders discovered diplomacy as their most important tool. Alliances with Muslim rulers were forged when it served their own interests. Sometimes Christians concluded treaties with Damascus against Egypt, sometimes with the Ayyubids in Cairo against rival emirs in Syria. Religion did not always play the first role. Power politics and self-preservation determined action. Marriages were also used as an instrument. European nobles associated themselves with families from the East, sometimes even with Christian groups outside Latin Catholicism, such as the Armenians or Syrian Christians. These alliances strengthened the fragile rule, but also made it complicated and prone to internal conflicts. Trade and exchange. While knights and castles shaped the image of the Crusaders, trade also played an increasingly important role. Italian cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa established trading colonies in Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli. They brought not only goods from the west, but also wealth and ships that were indispensable for defense. However, these traders did not only bring advantages to the Crusader states. They competed fiercely with each other. Their rivalries led to bloody street battles in the ports, and their dominance made the Crusader states increasingly dependent on the commercial interests of the Italian cities. A fragile equilibrium. This created a fragile equilibrium, a remnant kingdom that was militarily weak, diplomatically agile, and economically dependent on outsiders. It was a temporary empire that could only exist as long as its opponents remained divided and Europe was prepared to send new crusades at regular intervals. But that was exactly where the weakness lay. Europe was often busy with its own wars, and the enthusiasm for the crusade gradually faded. In the East, on the other hand, new forces were increasingly found who were determined to drive out the Crusaders once and for all. The Holy Land after the Third Crusade was not a secure possession, but a house of cards of alliances, agreements, and compromises. A single strong blow, and it could collapse. And this blow was soon to come, when Europe's energy was discharged in a different direction, against Constantinople itself. Chapter 12. The Fourth Crusade, 1202-1204, the conquest of Constantinople. When you tell the story of the Crusades, the Fourth Crusade seems like a foreign body. Instead of reconquering the Holy Land, instead of targeting Jerusalem or Acre,
This crusade ended with one of the greatest scandals of the Middle Ages, the sack of Constantinople, the capital of Christian Byzantium. A crusade that had begun to fight Muslims led to fratricide between Christians and weakened the Byzantine Empire so much that it never fully recovered. The plan and the reality. Originally, the Fourth Crusade was intended to attack Egypt. Many crusaders had realized that Egypt was the key to controlling the Holy Land, rich, strategic, and at the heart of Muslim power in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the crusaders faced a practical problem. They had to have ships to get there. So they turned to Venice, the powerful trading republic that had a huge fleet. Venice promised to provide ships for the entire army for an enormous price. However, when the Crusaders could not raise enough money, Venice demanded something in return. The detour to Zara. The Venetians persuaded the Crusaders to first conquer the city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a Christian city that was under Hungarian protection and a competitor of Venice. In 1202, Zara was conquered and plundered, an act that already showed how far the crusade had strayed from its original goal. Pope Innocent III was outraged and temporarily absolved the Crusaders from the church, but the procession continued. The pull to Constantinople. In this situation, a new factor came into play: the Byzantine prince Alexios Angelos, son of a deposed emperor. He promised the Crusaders money, ships, and support if they helped him regain the throne in Constantinople. For the Crusaders, who urgently needed funds, this sounded tempting. So it came about that the Crusader army stood in front of the walls of Constantinople in 1203. After fighting, it was actually possible to put Alexios on the throne. But it soon turned out that he could not fulfill his promises. Tensions between the Crusaders, the Venetians, and the Byzantine population escalated and led to catastrophe in April 1204. The sack of Constantinople. The Crusaders stormed the city, and what followed was such a level of destruction that even contemporary chroniclers were horrified. Churches were desecrated, monasteries plundered, sanctuaries plundered. Holy relics, golden icons, works of art, and treasures that had been at the heart of Byzantine Christianity for centuries were abducted. Horses were driven into the Hagia Sophia, altars were desecrated, monks and nuns were mistreated. For the Byzantines, it was an indelible trauma. Not Muslims, but Christians from the West had desecrated their holy city. The schism between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox world, which had been officially declared in 1054, now deepened irreconcilably. Consequences of the scandal. From the ruins, the Crusaders built the so-called Latin Empire of Constantinople, but it remained weak and volatile. Byzantium survived in remnant states such as Nicaea and Trebizond, but the glamorous capital was plundered and its power broken. The Fourth Crusade did nothing for the Holy Land. No foot of the Crusaders set foot in Jerusalem. No Muslim empire was weakened. On the contrary, the Crusade had decisively weakened the only Christian power in the East that could have helped the Crusader states, Byzantium. The Fourth Crusade thus marked a turning point. He showed how much the Crusades were also determined by political and economic interests, and how quickly the ideal of religious war could be displaced by worldly greed. The name Crusade lost much of its purity at that moment, and for the Orthodox world, it remained a symbol of betrayal by the West, a legacy that continued to have an impact for centuries.
Chapter 13. Children's Crusades and Popular Movements, Piety and Tragedy. In addition to the great crusades organized by kings and popes, there were also movements that arose from below, supported by the common people, by piety, hope, and often by despair. These so-called popular movements show another side of the history of the crusade, that of the people who were not knights, but farmers, craftsmen, women, children. The most impressive, though most tragic, is the story of the Children's Crusades. The Dream of Innocence. Around 1212, a wave of religious enthusiasm spread in France and Germany. Young people, some barely in their teens, believed that not weapons, but innocence and faith could win back the Holy Land. Preachers proclaimed that the children with their purity would take the walls of Jerusalem and convert the Muslims where knights and kings had failed. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of children and young people joined these processions, accompanied by adults who shared their vision. They carried crosses, sang songs, marched through towns and villages, while the population marveled at them as a sign of divine will. Tragic outcome. But the reality was cruel. Many of these children's crusades have already ended in Europe. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion decimated the groups. Some reached the ports of the Mediterranean, where they hoped to find ships to Palestine. But it was not the miracle that awaited there, but the fraud. Some were sold by unscrupulous traders, others scattered in poverty and misery. Not a single one of these children's trains reached Jerusalem. What remained were stories of tears, loss, and exploitation. For many contemporaries, however, it was a sign of the deepest piety, that even the children were willing to give their lives for the Holy Land. Other popular movements. The Children's Crusades were not the only ones of this kind. Again and again, there were movements of ordinary people who believed that they could defeat the Muslims with faith alone. In 1096, for example, during the First Crusade, peasant armies under leaders such as Peter the Hermit set out, only to be destroyed by the Seljuks in Asia Minor. Later, similar currents emerged, such as the so-called Shepherds' Crusades, in which hordes of peasants and shepherds, often without weapons and military leadership, moved to the Holy Land or Spain, driven by a mixture of religious zeal and social protest. Mirror of society. These popular movements show how deeply the Crusade idea had seeped into society. Not only knights and nobles felt addressed, but also the poorest, the hopeless, the children. For them, the Crusade was not just a war, but a path to redemption, a last hope to give meaning to faith in a world of hardship and uncertainty. But they also show the dangers of religious enthusiasm. Without organization, without supplies, without protection, the participants of such movements often became victims of hunger, violence, and exploitation. Their fate reveals the dark side of an idea that set people in motion but often led them to their doom. The Children's Crusades and popular movements left behind no empire, no castles, and no victories, only stories that testify to the mixture of piety and tragedy. They are a reminder that the Crusades were not only the history of kings and knights, but also of simple people who were seized by a great vision and were broken by it.
Chapter 14. The Fifth and Sixth Crusade. Egypt as the key to the Holy Land. After the loss of Jerusalem and the moderate success of the Third Crusade, it became increasingly clear that the Crusaders had to change their strategy. The Holy Land was difficult to hold as long as Egypt remained strong. Egypt was the breadbasket and power base of the Muslim world, rich in resources, strategically located, and with an army that could threaten the Crusaders in Syria and Palestine at any time. This is how the idea was born. Whoever conquers Egypt controls the Holy Land. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221. The Fifth Crusade began in 1217 under the leadership of Hungarian, Austrian, and German princes. Soon, the papal legate Pelagius, who dominated the crusade, joined in. His plan was clear: attack Egypt to use it as a base for further operations. The army landed in Egypt and began the siege of the city of Damiette, an important port fortress on the Nile. The siege dragged on for months, but finally the city fell in 1219. The victory could have been a turning point, but the Crusaders hesitated. Disagreement between the secular princes and the papal legate paralyzed the strategy. When the Crusaders finally dared to march on Cairo in 1221, it led to disaster. They became entangled in the floods of the Nile, were surrounded by the Egyptians, and had to surrender. Damiette was lost and the crusade ended in disgrace. It was a triumph for Muslims, a bitter defeat for Christians, which showed how dangerous internal disputes could be. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229. Only a few years later, a crusade of a very different kind took place. A crusade that was characterized not by battles, but by diplomacy. It was led by Frederick II, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick was an unusual ruler. educated, eloquent, fascinated by the science and culture of the Orient. But he was also a man full of conflicts with the papacy, which long accused him of not keeping his crusade vows. When Frederick finally left for the Holy Land in 1228, he was even excommunicated by the Pope, a crusader who was under the spell of the Church. Nevertheless, he succeeded in doing something that the knights and kings had failed to do before. He regained Jerusalem through negotiations. Frederick concluded a treaty with the Sultan al-Kamil of Egypt, a nephew of Saladin. He himself was under pressure and saw advantages in an agreement with Friedrich. It was agreed that Jerusalem would be handed over to the Christians without bloodshed, while the Muslims would continue to be allowed to keep their sanctuaries, including the Dome of the Rock. A victory without glory. When Frederick entered Jerusalem in 1229, he crowned himself king, in the absence of the patriarch and despite his excommunication. For him, it was a personal triumph, but for many contemporaries, it seemed like a victory without honor. Not a glorious campaign, not a massacre, not a massive battle, but a diplomatic deal. The agreement did not last long. As early as 1244, Jerusalem was lost again, this time for good. Nevertheless, the Sixth Crusade showed that there were other paths than endless wars, paths that were hardly recognized in the heated climate of the time. Result: the Fifth and Sixth Crusades show two extremes. On the one hand, the failed attempt to conquer Egypt by force of arms, suffocated by arrogance and disunity. On the other hand, Frederick II's diplomatic solution, which brought a peaceful result for a short time, but which was hardly appreciated by contemporaries. Both undertakings made it clear how difficult it had become to secure the Holy Land. Neither military force nor clever diplomacy could permanently change the course of history. The project of the Crusader states had become a struggle for time, and time was running against them. Chapter 15. The Seventh and Eighth Crusade, St. Louis and the End of the Dream. In the 13th century, the image of the Crusades had changed fundamentally. The first features had been carried by enthusiasm, by the miracle of the conquest of Jerusalem, and by the pathos of faith. But after centuries of fighting, losing, and winning, the energy had waned. Europe had grown tired, and the idea of the Crusade increasingly seemed like a relic. Only one person once again put all his strength behind the ideal: Louis IX of France, who later went down in history as Louis the Saint. The Seventh Crusade, 1248–1254. After the final loss of Jerusalem in 1244, Louis saw his mission clearly. He wanted to save the Holy Land. Like others before him, he realized that Egypt was the key, and so he prepared a massive campaign. With a huge fleet, he sailed to Cyprus in 1248, and from there on to Egypt. The first destination was again Damiette, the strategically important port town on the Nile. In 1249, the conquest was almost effortless. The Egyptian troops fled in panic, and the city fell without much resistance. For a moment, it seemed as if the road to Cairo was open, and the crusade was well on its way to success. But then the old tragedy repeated itself. The Crusaders hesitated, argued about how to proceed, and were finally surprised by the Nile flood. As they advanced towards Cairo, they fell into a trap set by the Egyptian troops. At Mansoura, the Crusaders were crushingly defeated, and Louis himself was taken prisoner. He was released only for a high ransom, while his army was scattered and weakened. The Seventh Crusade thus ended in disaster. Louis remained in the east for several years to strengthen the remaining fortresses of the Crusaders, but his dream of conquering Egypt and regaining the Holy Land from there had failed. The Eighth Crusade, 1270. But Ludwig did not give up. 2 decades later, already an old man, he prepared another crusade. This time he wanted to weaken the enemy on a new front, in North Africa. He believed that an attack on Tunis could break the backs of Muslims in the Mediterranean and clear the way for a renewed offensive in the east. But this plan was also questionable from the beginning. No sooner had the Crusaders landed in Tunis than the plague broke out in their camp. Disease and heat swept away hundreds, and soon Ludwig himself was also infected. On August 25, 1270, he died, weakened and feverish, in a tent outside the walls of Tunis, far from Jerusalem, far from Damiette, far from everything he had dreamed of. The end of an era. Ludwig's death marked the end not only of a crusade, but of an entire chapter. He was the last great king to go to the Holy Land with ardent faith. After him, no one made any serious attempts to save the Crusader states permanently. For his contemporaries, Ludwig was considered a martyr of the faith, and the Church soon canonized him. But in the sober balance, his undertakings were failures that devoured enormous resources and never reached the goal. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades revealed the exhaustion of Europe. The former enthusiasm had been extinguished, the forces had splintered, and the world had changed. Islam was strong, the Crusader states weak, and the idea of the crusade lost its luster. What remained was an ideal that no longer fit reality, and a series of defeats that sealed the end of the great dream of the Christian Orient.
Chapter 16. The Fall of Acre, 1291. The final end of the Crusader states. When St. Louis died in Tunis in 1270, the splendor of the Crusades had long since faded. Although the Crusaders still held some coastal cities in the Holy Land, most notably Acre, the new capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, their situation was hopeless. The once proud empires in the east had shrunk to a narrow band of fortresses on the Mediterranean. The fall of Jerusalem in 1244 had destroyed the dream, and now it was all about survival. Acre, let's de Bastion. At that time, Acre was a mosaic of peoples and interests. Italian traders from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa fought for influence. Orders of knights such as the Templars and Knights of St. John held their mighty castles. Pilgrims and adventurers from all over Europe flocked to the city. It was a mixture of market square, fortress, and refuge, a glamorous but at the same time torn metropolis. But the outer splendor could not hide the inner weakness. The Crusaders were at odds, their rule hung by a thread. Meanwhile, a new power was growing in the east, the Mamluks in Egypt. These former slave soldiers had risen to become the dominant force of the Middle East, disciplined, fanatical, and militarily superior. Their sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, was determined to close the last chapter of the Crusader states. The Siege of 1291. In the spring of 1291, a huge Mamluk army advanced to the walls of Acre. Contemporary sources speak of tens of thousands of warriors, of huge siege engines, and a determination that left no doubt. This was not a raid, this was the final battle. The defenders fought desperately. Knights Templar and Knights of St. John defended their castles with heroic bravery. Italian merchants made their ships available, and ordinary citizens took up arms. But the opponent was too strong. Day after day, catapults thundered against the walls. Storm ladders were erected, and soon it became clear that the city could not be held. On May 18, 1291, the Mamluks made their breakthrough. They stormed into the streets and a bloody slaughter ensued. Men, women, and children were slaughtered or taken into slavery. The last Templars entrenched themselves in their fortress, fought to complete destruction, and went down with it. With the conquest of Acre, the fate of the Crusader states was finally sealed. The end of the dream. Acre was the last important bastion of the Crusaders in the Holy Land. What remained were only small islands such as Cyprus or Rhodes, which served as basis for the knightly orders, but the great project of conquering and asserting Jerusalem was over. For the Muslims, this was a triumphant victory, the conclusion of a long struggle that had once begun with the first invaders from Europe. It was a shock for Christianity, but no longer a call to action. The enthusiasm for new crusades had died out, the forces of Europe were tied up elsewhere, and no one had the will to send another large army to the east. A legacy of blood and memory. The fall of Acre was not just a military event, but a symbol, the final failure of an idea that had moved Europe for 2 centuries. The great dream of the liberation of Jerusalem had become a pile of rubble. But precisely because the end was so dramatic, the memory of the Crusades remained alive. They had brought Europe into contact with the Orient, had promoted trade, culture, and knowledge transfer, but had also left behind countless massacres, destruction, and enmities. Acre marked the end of the time of the Crusades in the narrower sense,
but its aftermath was to shape the world for a long time to come.
Chapter 17. Crusades in Europe, Spain, the Baltics, and against heretics. When people talk about the Crusade, they usually think of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and the long marches to the east. But the idea of the Crusade was much broader in the Middle Ages. It was used not only against Muslims in the Middle East, but also in Europe itself, pagans in the north, Muslims in Spain, and even Christians who were considered heretics. The Crusade became a universal tool of the Church to legitimize wars and give them the splendor of religion. Spain, the Reconquista as a crusade. In Spain, where Christians and Muslims had struggled for supremacy for centuries, the fight against the Islamic empires of Al-Andalus in the 12th and 13th centuries was increasingly understood as a crusade. Popes granted the same indulgences to the warriors who took part in the Reconquista as to the Crusaders in the Holy Land. Battles such as Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 were celebrated as crusade battles. There, Spanish kings united with crusaders from all over Europe against the Almohads, a North African ruling house. The victory opened the way to the reconquest of large parts of the Iberian Peninsula. For many knights, Spain was easier to reach than Jerusalem, and, at the same time, a field on which they could reap the same spiritual reward. The Baltic Crusade. Another destination was the far north of Europe. Pagan people still lived there in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Prussians, Lithuanians, and other tribes along the Baltic Sea. To convert them, the Church proclaimed crusades, which soon became military conquests. The Teutonic Order, which had originally been founded in the Holy Land but now shifted its focus to the Baltic states, played a central role. From castles such as Malbork, he subjugated the pagan peoples, forced them to convert to Christianity, and established their own system of state orders. For the peoples concerned, this was a brutal colonial war, but for the Church, it was a northern crusade. Crusades against heretics. The expansion of the crusade idea in France was even more drastic. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the religious movement of the Cathars lived there, which was condemned by the Church as heresy. Instead of proceeding only with sermons or the Inquisition, Pope Innocent III proclaimed a crusade against them. The so-called Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, was of tremendous brutality. Entire cities in the south of France were destroyed, countless people were slaughtered, and the Occitanie region was forcibly forced into the sphere of influence of the French crown. The crusade against the Cathars showed how the former struggle against external enemies could now be turned against one's own fellow Christians. A tool of the Church. These examples illustrate how flexible and dangerous the idea of the crusade became. What had begun with the ideal of the liberation of Jerusalem developed into a general instrument of papal power politics. Any war that the Church considered just could now be marked with the seal of the crusade. Knights received the same indulgences, the same spiritual privileges, whether they fought in Acre, in Spain, in the Baltic states, or against neighbors in the south of France. Thus, the crusade became a European reality, not just a distant vision of the Orient. He shaped the mentality of people who saw violence in the name of faith as justified, and he expanded the borders of the Christian world militarily and ideologically. But the more the crusade itself became a weapon in Europe, the more it lost its original luster. The sacred mission often became a pretext for power, conquest, and oppression, a mirror of how closely faith and politics were intertwined in the Middle Ages. Chapter 18. The Image of the Enemy. Christians and Muslims in the mirror of the Crusades. The Crusades were not only wars over territories, castles, and cities, they were also battles over ideas, images, and enemy images. They shaped how Christians and Muslims saw each other, and often misunderstood. The encounters in the Holy Land created myths and clichés that had an effect long beyond the Middle Ages. The Christian's gaze. For the Christians of Europe, the Muslims were initially above all infidels who occupied the Holy Land and were thus considered enemies of God. Sermons described them as godless barbarians who desecrated holy sites and mistreated pilgrims. Such depictions served to justify the Crusades and to make one's own cause appear sacred. But the reality in the East was often more complex. Many crusaders found that Muslim cities were larger, richer, and more culturally developed than most cities in Europe. Merchants discovered the diversity of the Orient, knights got to know their opponents as capable warriors, and chroniclers described with amazement the power and splendor of Muslim rulers. Figures like Saladin, in particular, were associated with an ambivalent image. He was the great enemy, but at the same time a model of chivalrous virtue. Some Christian chroniclers described him almost admiringly as noble and magnanimous, a remarkable contrast to the caricatures circulated in sermons. The gaze of Muslims. The Muslims also developed an image of their opponents. For them, the Crusaders were strangers from the West who broke over the country like a storm. Many Arab chroniclers simply called them Franks, regardless of their origin. At first, they appeared as brutal invaders whose cruelty left deep wounds during the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. But over time, the picture changed. Muslims saw that the Crusaders were not only conquerors, but also rulers who built castles, traded, and formed alliances with local Christians and even Muslims. In some sources, they appear as primitive but brave opponents, a contrast to the highly developed urban life of the Islamic world. Saladin and his successors cleverly used the presence of the Crusaders to strengthen the idea of jihad. The fight against the Christians was propagated as a common goal that united the often quarreling Muslim princes. Thus, the Crusaders were seen not only as enemies, but also as tools of internal consolidation. Between encounter and misunderstanding. Despite all the enemy images, there were also encounters and exchanges. Traders, diplomats, and even orders of knights came into contact with Muslim rulers. There were phases of ceasefires, treaties, and even mutual admiration. Europeans learned about Arabic medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, while Muslims looked curiously at the organization and tenacity of the Crusaders. But these encounters did not change the fact that the basic tone of mistrust, fear, and demarcation remained. For Christians, the Muslim was the infidel. For Muslims, the Frank. These terms reduced the complex societies to simple opposites, a black and white image that often distorted reality. A legacy of images. The Crusades left a double legacy. On the one hand, they created respect, for example in the mutual recognition of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. On the other hand, they solidified images of the other that had an effect for centuries. For Europe, Islam became a symbol of the external enemy, against whom it defended itself in the name of God. For the Islamic world, the Crusaders were the example of the aggression of the West that threatened their countries. These images did not disappear with the fall of Acre, but shaped the relationship between Christians and Muslims for a long time, and in a certain way until today.
Chapter 19. Consequences of the Crusades: Economy, Culture, and Knowledge Transfer. The Crusades are often told as a chain of battles and sieges, of knights, kings, and castles, but their influence went far beyond that. They changed the societies of Europe and the Orient in a way that was felt long after the fall of Acre in 1291. In the end, they had failed in war, but culturally, economically, and intellectually, they left behind a legacy that led Europe into the modern era. Trade and economy. One of the most visible consequences was the revival of trade. The Crusaders brought not only weapons and armor to the Holy Land, but also merchants, who soon used an extensive network of trade routes. Cities such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa became the great winners of the Crusades. They organized the transport of the armies, supplied the Crusader states, and opened markets that permanently changed trade with the Orient. New products reached Europe via these trade routes. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg, sugar, cotton, glassware, silk, and other luxury goods. What was initially an exotic treasure soon became part of everyday European life and the cornerstone for the growing prosperity of many cities. Knowledge transfer. At least as important was the transfer of knowledge. In the cities of the Orient, Europeans encountered a culture that was far advanced in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Arab doctors knew healing methods that were not spread in Europe until centuries later. Translations of Greek and Arabic texts brought Aristotle, Galen, or Avicenna back to the West. Influences were also evident in architecture and technology. Oriental-style castles, improved siege engines, and even elements of urban planning found their way to Europe. New plants were introduced in agriculture, such as rice, citrus fruits, or mulberry trees for silk production. Meeting of cultures. The Crusades were also a time of encounters. Not only warriors met, but also pilgrims, traders, scholars, and diplomats. In the Crusader states, Christians, Muslims, and Jews often lived next door to each other, sometimes in enmity, sometimes in peaceful coexistence. This exchange was not always voluntary, but it brought a new cosmopolitanism. Europeans who had traveled to the Orient returned with new impressions of foreign dishes, garments, customs, and ideas. The image of the other became more complex, even if the enemy images remained. Societal impact in Europe. The Crusades also had profound social consequences. Many nobles who had moved to the East left behind unclear inheritances and new power relations. Knightly orders such as the Templars and Knights of St. John became influential institutions that operated across continents. At the same time, the idea of the Crusade strengthened the authority of the papacy. Urban sermon in Clermont had made the beginning, and for centuries, the Pope remained the one who could proclaim crusades and thus set the whole of Europe in motion. Even though the enthusiasm waned over time, the influence of this idea was enormous. Ambivalent legacy. But the consequences were not only positive. The Crusades also brought violence and destruction to Europe itself, for example, in the Jewish pogroms along the Rhine or in the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars. They consolidated the image of religious war, which legitimized violence in the name of faith. This legacy continued to have an effect for a long time. Thus, the Crusades remain an ambivalent chapter. They opened Europe to trade, knowledge, and culture, contributed to the rise of cities and the beginning of the Renaissance, and at the same time left deep wounds, mistrust, and a legacy of religious intolerance. In their successes as well as in their dark sides, they were a decisive link between the Middle Ages and modern times. Chapter 20. Reverberations and Myth. The Crusades in the Memory of the World. With the fall of Acre in 1291, the era of the Crusades in the narrower sense ended. But in truth, they lived on, not on the battlefields, but in the minds and memories. They became a myth that continued to have an effect in Europe and the Orient for centuries, transfigured, condemned, reinterpreted, and politically instrumentalized. In Europe, for a long time, the Crusades were a glorious chapter for Christendom. Chroniclers and preachers praised the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 as a miracle of God, the deeds of Richard the Lionheart as the epitome of chivalrous bravery. Even defeats such as those of Hattin or Damietta were often interpreted as God's punishment for the sins of Christians, not as proof of the superiority of the opponents. In later memory, the Crusades also became part of the national heritage. France, for example, revered Louis IX as a holy king and martyr. England, Richard the Lionheart as a symbol of knightly greatness. The knightly orders lived on as legends. Their castles and myths shaped the image of the Middle Ages. In the Orient, memory was quite different in the Islamic world. There, the Crusaders were seen as intruders, as strangers who occupied holy cities with violence and cruelty. The massacres during the capture of Jerusalem left deep wounds, and the stories of destruction and violence have been passed down through generations. But here too a myth arose, that of resistance. Figures like Saladin became heroes who liberated the country from the foreigners. To this day, he is considered a symbol of unity, strength, and dignity in the face of Western threats in the Arab world. In modern times, with the end of the Middle Ages, the direct reference to the Crusades faded, but they remained part of the imagination. In the Renaissance and Enlightenment, they were increasingly viewed critically as examples of fanaticism and religious delusion. At the same time, they inspired literature, art, and romantic ideas of chivalry. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Crusades took on a new meaning. European colonial powers sometimes saw themselves in line with the Crusaders when they conquered the Orient. Conversely, Arab thinkers took up the memory of the Crusaders to interpret the resistance against the West. The term crusade became a buzzword, often far removed from historical events. A shared heritage. Today, the Crusades are seen as a symbol of the ambivalence of history. On the one hand, for the cultural exchanges that enriched Europe, and on the other hand, for the violence that was perpetrated in the name of faith. They show how religion and politics can merge, how myths set peoples in motion, and how deep the consequences of such movements can be. The Crusades are not just a chapter of the Middle Ages. They are part of a collective memory that continues to have an impact on the present. Whether in speeches, novels, or political slogans, the Crusade remains a strong image that stands for many meanings: for faith and sacrifice, for cruelty and fanaticism, for encounter and misunderstanding. Result: the Crusades began as a call to Jerusalem, carried by faith and hope. They ended in the blood of Acre, in defeats, divisions, and disillusionment. But their real effect was not in military success, but in the reverberations they left behind in cultures. Thus, the Crusades are more than a sequence of battles. They are a mirror of human longing for meaning, for redemption, for greatness, and they remind us how easily this longing can turn into violence.